Margaret had been working as a live-in maid at the Ashford estate for nearly 3 years, though most days it felt like she was invisible. The sprawling mansion sat on 20 acres of manicured grounds, and she moved through its rooms like a ghost, dusting furniture that nobody sat on, cleaning windows that nobody looked out of, and preparing meals that were often left half-eaten. The pay was modest but steady, and in her 50s, Margaret had learned not to ask for more than what was offered. The Ashford family consisted of Richard Ashford, a wealthy investor who had made his fortune in commercial real estate, his ex-wife who lived in California, and their 10-year-old son, David. Richard had custody during the school year, and David attended a private academy for blind children about 40 minutes away. The boy was brilliant but withdrawn, according to the few conversations Margaret had overheard between Richard and his assistant. Richard often spoke to people about David's condition with the tone of someone describing a problem that needed solving rather than a child who needed understanding. Margaret first really noticed David on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard him come home from school, his cane tapping against the marble floors in the hallway. His father was in his study, on a conference call that would last for hours, judging by the pattern Margaret had observed over 3 years. David stood in the kitchen doorway, his hand gripping the frame, looking lost in a way that made Margaret's chest tighten. She didn't treat him differently because he was blind. This was something she never quite understood about how other people behaved around David. They spoke louder, as though blindness affected his hearing. They moved things out of his way with exaggerated care, as if he were made of glass. Margaret simply continued chopping vegetables and asked him if he wanted a snack. His face brightened at the normal tone in her voice, and he nodded. She described where the stool was by the counter, and he found it easily. Over the following weeks, Margaret realized that David spent a great deal of time alone. His father hired tutors and therapists, but there were gaps between those appointments where the boy wandered the house or sat in the library listening to audiobooks. Margaret began talking to him during these times. She wasn't trying to be a teacher or a mother figure. She was simply the only person in the house who treated him like an ordinary child instead of a special case. One afternoon, David asked her about the plants on the back terrace. Margaret took him outside and let him touch the leaves, describing the textures and smells. She talked about how plants needed light and water and how each one was different. David asked questions, real questions, the kind that showed he was thinking and curious. Margaret found herself spending more time with him, and David began seeking her out, always polite, always grateful, never demanding. By the second year, something had shifted. David started asking Margaret to read to him, not the books his tutors assigned, but stories he chose. They would sit in the kitchen while she prepared meals, and she would read aloud. Sometimes she would describe what was happening in her own tasks as she worked, narrating the colors and textures and processes of cooking. David absorbed it all with the intensity of someone learning a language. Margaret taught him about the garden by letting him help. She guided his hands to show him how to plant seeds, how to feel the difference between soil that was too wet and soil that was just right. She played music while they worked and talked about the sounds she heard, the rhythms that mattered. She never made it feel like therapy or education. It felt like what it was, a woman and a boy spending time together. What Margaret didn't fully realize was that David was changing. He became more confident, more engaged. His teachers noticed and mentioned it to Richard. His father attributed the improvement to the new therapy program he had enrolled David in, a program that had begun right around the same time Margaret had started talking to his son in the kitchen. Richard was pleased with the results and continued writing checks to fund interventions that he believed were making the difference. Margaret never spoke to Richard about her time with David. She knew her place in the house. She was the maid, and he was the millionaire who employed her. He rarely spoke to her at all beyond the occasional instruction about household matters. She didn't expect him to notice what happened between her and his son. These moments belonged to her and David, small treasures of connection that existed in the spaces Richard's busy life didn't occupy. Then one afternoon in early winter, everything changed. Richard came home earlier than expected from a meeting. He walked through the house and found Margaret and David in the kitchen together. David was describing a texture he felt while Margaret worked, and they were both laughing at something the boy had said. Richard stood in the doorway, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. She knew immediately that something about this moment had registered with him differently than all the others. She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, ready to excuse herself and remove herself from his view. But Richard didn't dismiss her. Instead, he asked David what he and Margaret had been talking about. David eagerly explained, his words tumbling over each other as he described the lesson about plants, the cooking project they had planned, the books they were reading together. As Margaret watched, she saw Richard's face change, and she couldn't quite read what was happening behind his eyes. Richard didn't say anything immediately. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his briefcase still in hand, listening to his son speak with an animation he rarely heard. David's words came quickly, enthusiastically, painting a picture of afternoons spent learning about the world in ways that went beyond what any therapist or specialized tutor had offered. When David finally paused, Richard set down his briefcase slowly and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. Margaret felt frozen. She had prepared herself many times for this moment, rehearsing in her mind how she would apologize for overstepping, how she would explain that she hadn't meant to intrude on his parenting, how she would accept whatever consequences came. But Richard didn't look angry. He looked something closer to shaken. He asked David to describe what Margaret had taught him, and David launched into explanations about plants and cooking and music and textures. The boy talked about how Margaret let him help with real tasks instead of special accommodated versions. He talked about how she trusted him to understand things. After about 10 minutes, Richard sent David upstairs to start his homework. The boy hesitated, clearly wanting to stay, but he obeyed his father's request. Once they were alone, Richard looked directly at Margaret for what might have been the first time in 3 years. She could see him processing something, working through thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He asked her how long this had been happening. Margaret told him honestly that it had been almost 18 months, that it had started small and gradually grown into something more structured. She explained that she hadn't meant to overstep, that David had simply seemed lonely, and she had kept him company during her breaks. She was careful with her words, trying not to sound defensive, but also trying to make clear that everything she had done came from a place of genuine care for his son. Richard didn't respond immediately. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the winter garden. Margaret could see him trying to reconcile something. Finally, he turned back and asked her what she had observed about David over these months. It was an odd question, and Margaret wasn't sure if it was a test. She answered carefully. She said that David was intelligent and curious, and that he had a deep capacity for understanding when people treated him with respect. She said that he didn't need special treatment so much as he needed to be included in real life rather than isolated by his condition. She said that, in her opinion, many of the programs Richard had enrolled him in seemed to focus on what David couldn't do rather than what he could learn to do differently. She stopped herself there, realizing she might have gone too far, but Richard asked her to continue. So she did. She told him that David had taught her as much as she had taught him, that his mind was sharp and his insights were sometimes surprising. She said that when you spent time with someone, really spent time with them, you began to see them as a person first and their limitations second. Margaret was nervous saying these things, but Richard's expression suggested he was listening in a way that mattered. He asked her about her background, how she had come to work as a maid, whether she had any formal training in education or child development. Margaret explained that she had raised 2 children of her own, both now grown, and that she had worked various jobs over her life. She didn't have certifications or degrees, just experience and instinct. She said this almost apologetically, as if her lack of credentials somehow diminished what she had been doing with David. Richard seemed to consider this. He said something that surprised her. He said that David's progress over the last year had been remarkable, that his teachers had noted significant improvements in his confidence and engagement. He said that he had attributed these changes to the new therapeutic interventions he had implemented. But now he wondered if the real change had come from something else entirely. He looked at Margaret directly and asked if she understood what she had actually accomplished. Margaret wasn't sure what he meant. She said she had just spent time with his son, that David was a good boy who deserved to be treated normally. Richard nodded slowly, and she could see something shifting in his perception of her. He asked if she had ever considered more formal work with children, perhaps in an educational capacity. Margaret thought he was asking whether she wanted to leave her job as a maid, and she quickly assured him that she was content with her position. She had never sought more than she had. Richard left the kitchen but came back about an hour later. He asked if they could talk in his study. Margaret followed him, her heart beating anxiously. The study was a room she rarely entered, all dark wood and expensive furniture. Richard sat behind his desk, and Margaret remained standing until he indicated she should sit. He told her that he had made some calls. He had spoken to David's school director and his primary therapist. Both of them had independently mentioned that David's breakthrough seemed to correspond with something in his home life rather than the school programs. When Richard asked them to speculate about what that might be, neither could say specifically. But Richard had figured it out by listening to David talk about his time in the kitchen. He said something then that Margaret didn't expect. He said that he had been absent, not just physically, but in a more fundamental way. He said that he had approached David's blindness as a problem to solve through programs and professionals, when what David had actually needed was a person who saw him. He said that Margaret had done something that cost him nothing and had given his son everything. Richard explained that he wanted to restructure her employment. He wanted to increase her salary significantly. He wanted to create a formal role for her in David's education, with some flexibility so that she could continue her household work. He said that he wanted to pay for Margaret to take some online courses in special education if she was interested, not because she needed credentials to do what she was doing, but because he wanted to support her development. He said he wanted to do right by someone who had done right by his son when he had failed to. Margaret felt tears forming. She had prepared herself to be dismissed, to be told to stay away from David, to be punished for crossing a line she hadn't even realized she was crossing. Instead, this man was offering her recognition and opportunity. She said yes before she could think too much about whether she should. The changes happened gradually but deliberately. Richard worked with an education consultant to design a curriculum that incorporated Margaret's informal teaching methods with more structured learning objectives. Margaret attended online courses in special education and child development, studying in the evenings after David was asleep. She found that much of what she had been doing intuitively aligned with established pedagogical principles, which gave her confidence that she was on the right track. David's reaction to the formalization of their time together was mixed at first. He worried that it would feel like school, like the tutoring sessions he sometimes found tedious. But Margaret assured him that they would keep doing the things they already did, just with more intention behind them. She explained that his father had recognized how much progress he was making and wanted to support that growth. David seemed to accept this, though he occasionally asked Margaret if his father was disappointed in him for needing so much help. Margaret told him the truth. She said that his father had learned something important, that progress didn't always come from the most expensive programs or the most credentialed specialists. Sometimes it came from someone spending real time with you, believing in your potential, and trusting that you could understand the world even if you experienced it differently. David listened to this explanation seriously, and Margaret could see him processing it, beginning to understand that his father's shift in attention was a gift. Richard began eating dinner at home more consistently. He would join Margaret and David in the kitchen, and at first his presence made things awkward. David seemed nervous, and Margaret found herself being more formal, more careful with her language, but Richard seemed aware of this. He sat back and let Margaret and David lead the conversation. He asked questions that showed he was genuinely interested in what they were learning together. Gradually, the tension eased. One evening, Richard mentioned that he had attended a parent association meeting at David's school. He said that several teachers had asked him what had changed for David, that they were seeing dramatic improvements in the boy's willingness to engage in challenging material. Richard had explained, carefully and honestly, that his son had benefited from someone taking genuine interest in him outside of a therapeutic framework. He said that the teachers had seemed almost surprised by this explanation, as if they expected some complex intervention rather than simple human connection. Margaret continued to manage the household, but her days became structured differently. She spent mornings on her coursework, afternoons with David on their learning activities, and early evenings on household tasks. Richard hired an additional housekeeper to help with the more demanding cleaning and maintenance work. Margaret initially felt guilty about this, as if she were being excused from responsibilities. But Richard explained that he wanted her time and energy focused on what mattered most, which was David's development. David's confidence grew in visible ways. He began asking to attend more social events at his school, activities he had previously avoided. He participated in a music program, something Margaret had encouraged after noticing his acute sensitivity to sound. He made friends, real friendships with other students, relationships that seemed to sustain him beyond the school day. He started talking about the future in ways that suggested he believed he had options, that his blindness didn't define the scope of what he could become. Margaret also changed during this time. She took a genuine pride in her work with David, in the progress she could document and observe. She began to see herself differently, not as a maid who happened to spend time with the boy, but as an educator, a mentor, someone whose knowledge and skills had real value. The online courses she completed gave her a framework for understanding what she had been doing intuitively. She learned about different learning styles, about how to scaffold learning experiences, about how to balance independence with support. Richard's transformation was perhaps the most striking. He became more present, not just in his attendance at home, but in his actual engagement with his son. He began asking Margaret for advice on parenting decisions, something she found both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable. She tried to be careful not to overstep, not to presume that her relationship with David gave her authority over his upbringing. But Richard seemed to want her input, to value her perspective based on the countless hours she spent with his son. The relationship between father and son deepened in ways that Margaret observed, but didn't directly facilitate. Richard began taking David on outings specifically designed around the boy's interests. He attended David's music recitals and school events with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligation. He started having conversations with David about his thoughts and dreams rather than simply monitoring his progress through reports from teachers and therapists. Margaret sometimes felt that she was watching Richard discover his own son. About 18 months into these changes, Richard asked Margaret to join him and David for lunch at a restaurant David wanted to try. It was an unusual request. Margaret had never socialized with the family outside of the household. She almost declined, but David overheard the conversation and immediately asked her to come. So she did. At the restaurant, Richard said something that caught Margaret off guard. He said that he wanted to formalize an arrangement. He wanted Margaret to become David's official tutor and mentor, with a salary and benefits that reflected the importance of her role. He wanted to create a position that would allow her to continue working with David for as long as David needed her or wanted her. He said that David's progress had been extraordinary, but more importantly, the boy had been given something that couldn't be bought or hired through conventional channels. He had been given a person who believed in him. Margaret felt the weight of gratitude and responsibility in those words. She looked at David, who was smiling, clearly aware that something significant was happening. She looked at Richard, who seemed to be waiting for her response with some anxiety, as if he worried she might refuse. She accepted. Not because she needed more money or a fancier title, but because she understood now that what had started as a simple act of kindness had become something more purposeful. She had helped transform how David saw himself and how his father saw his son. The work mattered, and she wanted to continue it with full commitment. The years that followed established a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Margaret worked with David through his teenage years, adapting her methods as he matured and his interests evolved. The informal kitchen lessons transformed into structured study sessions where Margaret helped David explore subjects that captivated him. He developed a particular passion for history and literature, fields where his blindness posed no inherent barrier to excellence. David's school performance improved dramatically. He began taking advanced placement courses and was eventually nominated for academic honors. Teachers started seeking Margaret out for advice on how to best support David in their classrooms. Margaret found herself in an unexpected role as an advocate and consultant, helping other educators understand that accommodation didn't mean lowering standards, but rather finding different pathways to the same goals. Richard's relationship with his son continued to deepen. Father and son began taking regular trips together, adventures that Richard planned with David's input and interests in mind. They traveled to museums where David could experience exhibits through touch and detailed audio descriptions. They attended concerts and literary festivals. Richard documented these experiences and later told Margaret that these moments had become the most meaningful part of his life as a parent. He said that he had almost missed them entirely, had almost let his anxiety about David's condition prevent him from seeing his son's potential. The household itself became a different kind of space. David invited friends over regularly, and Margaret found herself in the role of facilitator, someone who made sure that David's home was an inclusive space where he could be fully himself. She cooked meals that David's friends enjoyed, created an environment where his blindness was simply a fact rather than a focal point. Richard observed these gatherings with something approaching wonder, grateful that his son had developed the social confidence and connections that seemed natural now, but that had once seemed unlikely. Margaret also experienced professional growth that surprised her. Richard encouraged her to present at educational conferences about her work with David. She was nervous about public speaking, about standing in front of rooms full of credentialed educators, and discussing methods that had emerged from instinct rather than formal training. But she did it, and she discovered that her perspective resonated with people. Teachers and parents approached her afterward with their own stories, their own experiences of children who had flourished when given genuine attention and belief. David turned 16, then 18. The question of his future became more concrete. He began exploring college options, universities that had strong support services for students with visual impairments and programs aligned with his academic interests. Margaret helped him prepare applications, coached him through essays, and supported him as he navigated the college admissions process with the same careful attention she had always given to his growth. During this time, Richard asked Margaret to sit down with him in his study again, much as he had years before. But this conversation was different. He wanted to discuss what would happen when David went to college. He said that he assumed Margaret would want to step back from her formal role, that David would need to develop more independence, that the intensity of their work together would naturally decrease. Margaret had thought about this possibility, of course, She had wondered how to gracefully transition out of David's life as he became more autonomous. But when Richard suggested it directly, she found herself hesitant. She told him that she understood his point, that David did need to develop independence. However, she said, she would like to continue being part of his life in whatever capacity made sense. She said she had come to care deeply about David, not in a parental way exactly, but in a way that suggested she wanted to remain connected to him. Richard smiled at this, and Margaret could see relief in his expression. He said that he had hoped she would say that. He said that David often talked about what his life would be like in college, and he spoke of Margaret as a constant, someone he could count on regardless of what other challenges he faced. Richard said that perhaps Margaret could continue in a modified role, available for consultations and support as needed, but with more flexibility and freedom than her current arrangement allowed. They discussed the practical details. Margaret's position would become more flexible. She would maintain her salary and benefits, but her schedule would adjust once David went to college. She could take on other students if she wished, applying her methods and expertise to help other young people navigate learning and growth. Or she could simply maintain her availability for David while taking on other household responsibilities at the estate. Richard said the choice was hers. Margaret chose a combination of both. She began working with other families in the community, families with children who had various learning differences or disabilities. She brought to these relationships the same philosophy that had guided her work with David. See the child first, understand their individual needs and strengths, and create learning experiences that felt like authentic participation in the world rather than remedial intervention. Her work with these other students was rewarding in different ways than her work with David had been. She was no longer discovering the methods as she went along. She had frameworks now, experience, understanding of how to recognize when a child was ready to move forward and when they needed more time and support. Yet the essence remained the same. She spent time with children, really spent time with them, and helped them see themselves as capable and worthy of genuine engagement. David eventually went to college at a university about 3 hours away. Margaret and Richard attended his orientation, and Margaret felt a particular kind of pride watching David navigate the campus, asking intelligent questions of the Disability Services coordinator, advocating for himself with a confidence that seemed to come naturally now. Richard stood beside her, and she could see moisture in his eyes as he watched his son. The separation was harder than Margaret had anticipated. She had spent such a large part of her adult life with David that the rhythm of her days felt disrupted without him. But David called regularly, and they talked about his classes and his friends and his experiences. Margaret helped him work through academic challenges when he needed support. She listened to him process social situations and personal growth. She remained, as Richard had said, a constant. When David came home for his first winter break, he was visibly different. He was more confident, more settled in himself. He had made friends who knew nothing of his blindness before meeting him, people who related to him first as David and only secondarily understood his visual impairment as one characteristic among many. He had excelled in his classes. He had begun to envision a future that extended beyond what anyone, including Margaret in the early days, might have predicted. On Christmas Eve, David asked Margaret to sit with him in the library, where they had read so many books together over the years. He told her that he wanted her to know something. He said that he understood now what she had done for him, not just in terms of education or specific skills, but in terms of how she had seen him. He said that she had treated him with a respect and expectation that had fundamentally shaped how he saw himself. He said that without her, he didn't know who he would be. Margaret told him that he had become himself. She said that she had simply been there while he grew into who he was always going to be. She said that his intelligence and his kindness and his resilience had been his own all along. What she had done was simply create space for those qualities to emerge. David smiled at this answer, and they sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who have truly known each other. 5 years after David left for college, Margaret received a phone call that brought everything full circle. David had graduated from university with honors, completed a master's degree in public policy, and had just accepted a position with a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving educational access for children with disabilities. He was calling to tell Margaret that he wanted her to be part of his work. He explained that the organization was launching a new initiative focused on training educators and parents in what they were calling relational learning approaches. David had pitched his own story to the board, not as an exceptional case, but as an illustration of what became possible when children were treated as capable individuals rather than collections of deficits. He wanted Margaret to be a co-developer of the program, to help create training materials and curricula based on the methods that had worked so well for him. Margaret was stunned. She had never imagined that her work with David would extend beyond their personal relationship into something with broader impact. But David was insistent. He said that what Margaret had created wasn't special because of any particular technique or credential. It was special because it came from genuine respect and belief. He wanted to help other educators and families understand and replicate that approach. Richard, now in his 60s and semi-retired from his real estate business, became an unexpected advocate for the initiative as well. He began using his considerable financial resources and business connections to support David's nonprofit work. He established a foundation dedicated to improving educational outcomes for children with disabilities, with Margaret's relational learning approach as a core component of the foundation's funding priorities. Margaret found herself in a position she had never sought, but that felt absolutely right. She and David developed a training program that was deceptively simple in its core message, but transformative in its application. They taught educators and parents that the first step in supporting a child with any kind of difference or disability was to see the child as a person first. They emphasized that accommodation and accessibility were not optional extras but fundamental rights. They shared David's story not as inspiration, but as evidence that change was possible when people approached children with genuine belief in their potential. The work took Margaret around the country. She gave presentations at universities and school districts. She consulted with families navigating similar situations. She trained special education teachers, many of whom came to her programs burned out by a system that often focused on limitations rather than possibilities. Margaret brought to these spaces a grounded wisdom that came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge alone. What struck people most consistently was Margaret's humility. She never positioned herself as an expert who had discovered some revolutionary method. She talked about her work with David as a partnership, a mutual learning process where she had been as transformed by him as he had been by her. She acknowledged that much of what she had done came from cultural values about respect and dignity that didn't require any special credential to implement. She challenged the idea that children with disabilities needed extraordinary interventions when what they often needed was ordinary inclusion and genuine belief. David worked on the policy side of the nonprofit while Margaret focused on training and implementation. They made an effective team, the student and the teacher who had become colleagues and partners in a larger mission. Richard attended the board meetings of the foundation and took genuine pride in watching his son direct meaningful work in the world. 7 years after David's college graduation, Margaret was invited to speak at a national education conference. The organizers wanted her to share her story and her approach with several thousand educators. Margaret almost declined. She had done many presentations by this point, but something about the scale of this particular conference intimidated her. She called David to tell him she was thinking about declining the invitation. David told her something that she had never heard him say so directly before. He said that she had given him the confidence to believe that his blindness didn't have to limit his life. He said that she had shown him through her actions that he was worthy of genuine investment and attention. He said that now it was time for her to accept that her work mattered on a scale that extended far beyond one boy in one kitchen. He told her that thousands of educators would listen to her at that conference. He told her that some of them would go back to their classrooms and change how they taught because of what she shared. He told her that other children would have different lives because Margaret had the courage to stand up and speak about what she had learned. Margaret went to the conference. She stood on a stage in front of thousands of people and told her story not as an extraordinary achievement, but as an ordinary one. She talked about a boy and a maid and a kitchen. She talked about how seeing someone fully, respecting their intelligence and capability, and creating space for them to grow required no special training, only intention and care. She talked about how one person's belief in another person could change everything. The response was overwhelming. Educators approached her for hours afterward, sharing their own stories, telling her about students in their lives who had been transformed by someone seeing them differently. Teachers said they would implement relational approaches in their classrooms. Parents said they would stop focusing on what their children couldn't do and start exploring what they could. Administrators committed to training their staff in these methods. In the months after the conference, Margaret received letters from educators all over the country describing changes they had made based on her presentation. A teacher wrote about a student with autism who had begun thriving when the teacher shifted from correcting deficits to building on strengths. A parent wrote about reconnecting with her teenage son with ADHD, when she stopped approaching his condition as a problem to solve and started seeing him as a person to know. A principal wrote about implementing school-wide policies that centered respect and genuine inclusion rather than accommodation as an afterthought. Richard attended a foundation board meeting where David presented data showing the impact of the training programs. Schools that had implemented the relational learning approach were seeing improvements in academic outcomes, student engagement, and school climate across the board. The approach was particularly transformative for students with disabilities, but the underlying principles seemed to benefit all children. The foundation was receiving funding requests from school districts across the country wanting to implement the training. Richard looked across the table at Margaret, who attended the meetings as the foundation's Director of Training and Program Development, a title that still sometimes made her laugh internally. He said something in that moment that acknowledged everything that had happened. He said that he had made his fortune in real estate, in buying and developing properties that increased in value. But he said that watching his son and Margaret develop the relational learning approach had been a different kind of investment entirely. He said that they were building something that would change lives for generations, that the return on investment in seeing people fully and believing in their potential was immeasurable. Margaret retired from her household work entirely, though she remained close to Richard and visited the estate often. She and David worked together on expanding the nonprofit's reach, developing new training materials, consulting with schools and districts that wanted to transform their approaches to education and disability. David eventually became the executive director of the foundation while continuing his policy work, and Margaret remained the heart of the educational mission, the woman who could translate complex ideas about learning and human potential into simple truths about seeing people. 15 years after that first afternoon in the kitchen, David gave a keynote speech at an international education conference. He told the story of his childhood, his blindness, his isolation, and the maid who had changed everything by treating him with respect. He talked about his father's transformation from someone who saw his son's disability as a problem to be solved to someone who saw his son as a person to be known. He talked about how one person's belief had expanded into a movement, how Margaret's simple philosophy of seeing children fully had influenced educational policy and practice in thousands of schools. He ended the speech by bringing Margaret on stage. He introduced her not as his former teacher but as the person who had taught him who he was. He said that she had shown him that blindness was not a tragedy, that his life had unlimited potential, that he was worthy of genuine investment and authentic relationships. He said that everything good in his life could be traced back to an afternoon when a maid in a kitchen treated a lonely boy like he mattered. Margaret stood beside David, holding his hand as he had once held her hand, learning to navigate the world. She looked out at the thousands of educators in the audience, at the people who had come to understand that transformation came not from extraordinary interventions, but from ordinary human connection founded on genuine respect. She thought about how her life had changed from that of an invisible servant in a grand house to a woman whose work influenced educational practice globally. She thought about how one child's need for attention had led to her finding purpose and meaning she had never anticipated. She thought about how seeing someone fully without judgment or pity could remake both their life and your own. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking about the thousands of children who would be seen differently because of what had started in a kitchen. Because one woman had chosen to treat a blind boy like he was extraordinary in the most ordinary way possible. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.